What do you want here? You parasite. Those were the first words my daughter-in-law spat at me in my own mountain lodge. I had come to heal, not to beg. After months in the hospital, I only wanted peace, the quiet of my husband's cabin, the place we built together with our own hands, board by board, dream by dream. Yet there she was, wearing my late husband's robe, his favorite burgundy fleece that still carried the faint scent of his aftershave, sipping wine from my grandmother's crystal glass, the one with the tiny chip on the rim that Harold always said gave it character. And she had the audacity to call me a parasite. When she hissed through her wine-stained teeth, "I'll call the police," I whispered back, my voice steady as winter stone, "Go ahead if you can." And from that very moment, standing in the doorway of my own sanctuary, watching this woman who had invaded my sacred space like a virus, I decided I would watch her world crumble piece by piece, silently, methodically, completely. If you already feel the sting of betrayal coursing through your veins like I did that frozen February evening, please like this video, subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. This story deserves to be heard. Every word of it deserves to echo in the chambers of justice. My name is Eleanor Brooks. I'm 67 years old, though some days I feel ancient and other days I feel like I'm just beginning to understand the world. I'm the widow of Colonel Harold Brooks, a man who served 3 tours overseas and came home to me every single time, just like he promised. A man who believed in honor, in keeping your word, in building something lasting with the person you love. This mountain lodge, this isn't just property to me. This isn't some vacation rental or investment opportunity. This is the manifestation of 38 years of marriage, of dreams sketched on napkins during late-night conversations, of weekends spent driving 4 hours each way to clear land and pour foundations and argue about where the kitchen window should face to catch the morning light. Harold and I bought this land in 1987 with money we'd saved for 15 years, penny by penny, sacrifice by sacrifice. We were both teachers then. He taught history at the local high school, and I taught 3rd grade. We lived in a cramped apartment above Mrs. Patterson's bakery, and every month we put away whatever we could spare, sometimes just $20, sometimes $50 if we were lucky. We built this lodge ourselves. Harold learned plumbing from YouTube videos, and I taught myself to tile by practicing on scraps of wood in our garage. We spent every weekend here for 3 years, sleeping in a tent while we raised the walls, installed the windows, connected the electricity. Our hands were permanently stained with wood stain and paint. Our backs ached constantly. But every evening, we'd sit on what would become our front porch, sharing a thermos of coffee and watching the sun set over the mountains, and we knew we were building more than a house. We were building our future. The day we moved in, Harold carried me over the threshold just like he had on our wedding day. He set me down in the living room and said, "Ellie, this is where we're going to grow old together." He kept that promise for 12 beautiful years before the cancer took him away from me, before the treatments failed, before I had to learn what it meant to wake up in a bed that was suddenly too big. In a house that echoed with memories but no longer rang with laughter. After Harold's funeral, after the military honors and the folded flag and the endless casseroles from well-meaning neighbors, I couldn't bear to be in this lodge alone. Every corner held his presence. The coffee mug he always used still sat in the dish drainer. His reading glasses were still on the nightstand, holding his place in a Tom Clancy novel he would never finish. So I went to live with my son Mark and his wife Melissa in the city. I thought it would be temporary, just until the grief softened enough for me to breathe again. I thought they wanted me there, that my presence was a comfort rather than a burden. I was wrong about many things in those days. This trip to the lodge was supposed to be my first step back toward independence, toward reclaiming the life Harold and I had built together. I had been in the hospital for 3 months with pneumonia that nearly killed me, pneumonia that left me weak and hollow and desperate for the clean mountain air that had always been my medicine. The doctors said I needed rest, quiet, peace. They said I needed to heal not just my lungs but my spirit. I had called ahead to let Mark and Melissa know I was coming. I told them I just needed a week, maybe 2, to remember who I was before I became a patient, before I became a burden, before I became invisible in my own life. They said, of course. They said take all the time I needed. They said they hoped the mountain air would restore me. They lied. The drive up to the lodge normally filled me with anticipation, with the gradual loosening of city tension as the road wound higher into the mountains, as the air grew thinner and cleaner, as the noise of traffic gave way to the whisper of wind through pine trees. But this time, as my old Honda climbed the familiar curves, something felt wrong. My instincts, sharpened by 67 years of life and disappointment, began to prickle like a cat sensing a storm. The first sign was the tire tracks in what should have been pristine snow. Multiple vehicles had been up and down this private road recently. Heavy tracks, the kind made by SUVs and trucks, not the careful path of my small car. As I rounded the final bend, my breath caught in my throat. There were 3 vehicles parked in my driveway. A black SUV I didn't recognize sat directly in my usual parking spot, as if announcing ownership. A red sedan was angled carelessly across the walkway. A pickup truck blocked the path to the woodshed Harold had built to store our winter supply of firewood. The lodge itself blazed with lights. Every window glowed warm and welcoming, but not for me. Music drifted from inside, something modern and loud that Harold and I had never played. The sweet smell of roasting meat carried on the winter air, mixed with the sound of laughter and conversation, the clink of glasses, the comfortable chaos of people who felt at home. But this was my home. Mine and Harold's. The deed was in my name. The mortgage was paid with my teacher's pension and Harold's military benefits. Every utility bill came to my address. Yet here I stood in the falling snow, feeling like a stranger approaching someone else's party. I walked to the front door on legs that suddenly felt older than my years, my hospital weak muscles protesting the cold and the elevation. The porch light, Harold's solar-powered LED that he'd installed with such pride because it meant we were living off the grid like real mountain folk, illuminated fresh boot prints in the snow. Size 12 at least. Heavy treads. Work boots or hiking boots, the kind Harold used to wear. I reached into my purse for my keys, the familiar weight of the keyring Harold had made from a piece of lodge foundation wood, carved and sanded smooth by his patient hands. But when I tried to slide the key into the lock, it wouldn't turn. Someone had changed the locks. On my house. My sanctuary. My healing place. The betrayal hit me like a physical blow. I actually staggered backward, my weak lungs struggling for air in the thin mountain atmosphere. Someone had changed the locks to keep me out of my own home. Someone had decided I no longer belonged in the place I had built with my own hands and paid for with my own money. But the lock wasn't the only thing they'd changed. I tried the handle and the door swung open easily. They hadn't even bothered to lock it. Why would they? They thought they owned the place now. The warmth and light and noise of the house hit me like stepping into another world. My world, transformed and claimed and occupied by strangers. No, not strangers. Family. Which somehow made it worse. The first thing I saw was my living room, filled with people I didn't recognize. Young couples in expensive winter wear, holding wine glasses and laughing at some joke I hadn't heard. Children running between the adults, their shoes muddy from playing outside, their voices echoing off the vaulted ceiling Harold and I had argued about for months before deciding the extra cost was worth it for the sense of space and grandeur. The furniture had been rearranged. Harold's favorite chair, the leather recliner where he'd spent countless evenings reading military history books and occasionally dozing off while the fire crackled, had been pushed into a corner to make room for a folding table loaded with food. Expensive food. Imported cheeses and artisanal crackers and bottles of wine that cost more than Harold and I used to spend on groceries in a month. But what stopped my heart completely was the mantelpiece. For 12 years, it had held a framed photograph of Harold and me on our wedding day, his dress blues perfect and pressed, my white dress simple but elegant, both of us young and hopeful and so certain that love could conquer anything. That photograph was gone. In its place sat a large family portrait I'd never seen before, showing Melissa's parents and siblings in matching Christmas sweaters, their smiles bright and possessive. They had erased Harold from his own home. They had erased me from my own home. They had claimed it and redecorated it and filled it with their own people, their own food, their own memories, as if 38 years of our life together had never happened. I stood in the doorway, invisible in my own house, watching strangers celebrate in the space where Harold and I had planned our retirement, where we had dreamed of growing old together, where his ashes still sat in a simple urn on what used to be our bedroom dresser. The first person to notice me was a woman I didn't recognize, someone's sister or cousin or friend, holding a glass of what looked like expensive champagne in her perfectly manicured hand. She nudged the person next to her and whispered something, and slowly, like ripples in a pond, the conversation began to fade as more and more people became aware of the strange old woman standing in their party. But Melissa, my daughter-in-law, the woman I had welcomed into our family with open arms and an open heart, the woman whose wedding I had helped pay for, whose children I had loved like my own grandchildren, was standing with her back to me at the kitchen island, cutting what looked like an expensive cheese and laughing at something someone had said. When she finally turned around, probably wondering why the room had gone quiet, her face went through a series of expressions that I will remember until the day I die. First confusion, as if she couldn't quite place me. Then recognition, her eyes widening as she realized who I was. Then something that might have been guilt, a quick flash across her features like sunlight on water. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, the guilt was gone, replaced by something hard and cold and calculating. She straightened her shoulders, lifted her chin, and arranged her features into an expression of barely contained irritation, as if I were a door-to-door salesman who had interrupted her dinner party. "You weren't supposed to be back so soon," she said, her voice carrying across the suddenly silent room with the authority of someone who belonged here, someone who had every right to be cutting cheese in my kitchen, drinking wine from my glasses, hosting parties with my electricity and my heat and my food. She paused, letting that statement hang in the air for a moment, and I realized that everyone in the room was staring at me, waiting to see what would happen next. Then Melissa laughed, a sound like breaking glass, and added with a smile that never reached her eyes, "What do you want here anyway? You parasite." The word hit me like a slap. Parasite. In my own home, wearing what I now realized was Harold's old robe, the burgundy fleece he'd worn every morning with his coffee, she called me a parasite. The room was so quiet I could hear the fire crackling in the fireplace Harold had built stone by stone, could hear the wind outside rattling the windows we had installed together, could hear my own heartbeat thundering in my ears like a war drum. Everyone was staring at me now, these strangers in my home, these friends and family of my daughter-in-law who had been told God knows what stories about the crazy old woman who used to live here, who probably still thought she owned the place, who was clearly delusional and possibly dangerous. I saw it in their faces, the mixture of curiosity and discomfort and pity. Poor Melissa, they were thinking. Having to deal with this confused old woman who didn't understand that things had changed, that the lodge belonged to the young people now, that she needed to accept reality and move on. I stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds, feeling the weight of their stares, feeling the sting of that word, parasite, echoing in my mind. A parasite. An organism that feeds off others without giving anything in return. A creature that takes and takes and takes until it kills its host. But then something shifted inside me, something Harold had taught me during his military years, something about the difference between retreating and regrouping, between surrender and strategic patience. I felt my spine straighten, felt my chin lift, felt a cold calm settle over me like armor. Melissa must have mistaken my silence for defeat because she pressed her advantage. "You know what? she said, reaching into her purse and pulling out her phone. I think I should call the police. This woman is trespassing. She held up the phone like a weapon, like a threat, her thumb hovering over the screen as if she were about to dial 911 and report a dangerous intruder. Around the room, her guests shifted uncomfortably, some nodding in agreement, others looking uncertain about this escalation. And that's when I spoke, my voice quiet but carrying clearly in the sudden silence, each word deliberate and precise and cold as the mountain air outside. Go ahead, I said, my eyes never leaving her face. If you can. The change in the room was immediate and electric. Melissa's face went pale, and I saw something flicker in her eyes that looked suspiciously like fear. But she was committed now, had gone too far to back down in front of all these people who were watching our little drama unfold like a reality television show. You heard her, Melissa announced to the room, her voice artificially bright. She's admitting she doesn't belong here. She gestured around the lodge with proprietary confidence. This place belongs to Mark and me now. My father-in-law left it to us when he died. The lie was so smooth, so confident, that I almost admired it. She had clearly been practicing this story, perfecting it, using it to explain to her friends and family how a teacher and a middle manager could afford a mountain lodge worth more than most people made in 5 years. Harold was so generous, she continued, warming to her theme. He knew Mark and I would take good care of this place, that we'd use it the way he intended. He wanted it to stay in the family. I listened to her rewrite history, watched her erase 38 years of my life with Harold, 38 years of payments and improvements and memories, replacing it all with a convenient fiction that made her the rightful heir and me the delusional old woman who couldn't accept that her time was over. Mark's grandmother understands, Melissa said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. Don't you, Eleanor? You know Harold wanted us to have this place. You know you can't take care of it anymore. You're sick, you're old, you need to be in assisted living where people can look after you properly. The manipulation was masterful. In front of all these witnesses, she was casting herself as the patient, long-suffering daughter-in-law dealing with a confused elderly relative who couldn't accept reality. She was the responsible adult making hard decisions for everyone's good. I was the problem that needed to be managed. But what cut deepest was the seed of truth in her lies. I was sick. I was old. I had been living in their house for 2 years because I couldn't bear to be alone in this lodge after Harold died. I had become dependent on them, financially and emotionally, and they had encouraged that dependence, had insisted I stay with them, had made me feel like family. Now I understood why. Not because they loved me, not because they wanted to help me heal, but because they wanted me out of the way while they claimed my life piece by piece. While they told everyone the lodge was theirs, while they used it for their parties and their weekend getaways, while they slowly convinced themselves and everyone else that Harold had left everything to them. My son Mark, my own flesh and blood, had been silent through this entire confrontation. He stood near the kitchen, holding a beer and staring at the floor like a guilty child. When I looked at him, really looked at him, I saw Harold's features warped by weakness and selfishness, and I felt something die inside me that would never come back to life. Mark, I said quietly, and his head snapped up like I'd shouted his name. Is this what you told them? That your father left this place to you? For a moment, I saw the little boy he used to be, the child who would climb into my lap after nightmares, who would hold my hand crossing busy streets, who would tell me he loved me every night before bed. But that little boy was gone, replaced by a man who looked at me with embarrassment and something that might have been resentment. Mom, he said, and his voice was pleading, as if I were the one being unreasonable. You know you can't live up here alone. You know this place is too much for you to handle. We've been taking care of it, maintaining it, paying for the utilities and the upkeep. Another lie, smooth as his wife's. I had been paying the utilities from my account for the past 2 years, automatic withdrawals that I had set up to make things easier while I lived with them in the city. The maintenance had been minimal because Harold and I had built this place to last, had used quality materials and proper construction techniques, had treated it like the investment in our future that it was. We've been living here off and on, Mark continued, gaining confidence as he spoke. Making sure everything's okay, making sure the pipes don't freeze, making sure the roof doesn't leak. We've been good stewards of Dad's legacy. Stewards. As if they were caretakers rather than thieves, as if they were preserving Harold's memory rather than erasing it, as if moving his photograph and changing the locks and hosting parties in his living room was somehow honoring his wishes. I realized then that they had convinced themselves their own lies were true. They had told the story so many times, had lived it so completely, that they actually believed Harold had intended for them to have this place, that I was just too grief-stricken and confused to remember properly. But I remembered everything. I remembered Harold's will, filed with our lawyer and stored in our safety deposit box. I remembered his explicit instructions that everything should go to me, that I should live in the lodge as long as I wanted, that only after my death should Mark inherit anything. I remembered Harold's private conversations with me about his concerns over Mark's financial responsibility, his worry that Melissa spent money faster than Mark could earn it. Most importantly, I remembered the manila folder in my car, the one containing all the documents that proved beyond any shadow of doubt that this lodge belonged to me and only me. Melissa's hand was already moving across her phone screen, her fingers flying as she typed what I assumed was a 911 call. Around the room, her guests watched with the fascinated horror of people witnessing a car accident, unsure whether to intervene or simply observe the drama unfolding before them. 911, what's your emergency? I could hear the tinny voice from her phone speaker, and Melissa's voice immediately took on the breathless, urgent tone of someone reporting a genuine crisis. Yes, I need police assistance at 1247 Mountain Ridge Road. There's an elderly woman here who's confused and trespassing on our property. She seems disoriented and possibly dangerous. We've asked her to leave, but she's refusing. Dangerous. Disoriented. Confused. Each word was chosen carefully, designed to paint me as a threat that needed to be removed for everyone's safety. I had to admire the strategy even as it infuriated me. She was creating a record, establishing a narrative that would justify whatever happened next. We're having a family gathering here, and she's disrupting everything, Melissa continued, her voice taking on a note of genuine distress that would have been convincing if I didn't know better. She claims this is her house, but it's not. It belongs to my husband and me. I think she might be having some kind of mental episode. I stood quietly through this performance, my hands folded in front of me, my expression calm. Around the room, people were whispering to each other, some nodding sympathetically at Melissa's plight, others looking uncertain about the situation they'd stumbled into. Yes, we'll wait for them, Melissa said, ending the call. She looked around the room triumphantly, as if she'd just solved a complex problem. They'll be here in 15 minutes. Eleanor, I really think you should leave now before this gets worse for you. 15 minutes. I had 15 minutes to prepare for what would either be my complete humiliation or my vindication. 15 minutes to decide whether to retreat in shame or stand and fight for what was rightfully mine. I walked slowly to the front door, my movements deliberate and unhurried. Several people stepped aside to let me pass, probably thinking I was finally coming to my senses and leaving voluntarily. But instead of walking out, I opened the door and stepped outside into the cold mountain air. The snow was falling harder now, fat flakes that caught the porch light and swirled in the wind like a living thing. I walked to my car, my feet crunching through the fresh snow, my lungs working harder in the thin air, but my mind completely clear. From the glove compartment, I retrieved the manila folder I had brought with me. The folder that contained the deed to the property, filed with the county clerk's office and bearing my name as sole owner. The folder that contained Harold's will, properly witnessed and notarized, leaving everything to me. The folder that contained utility bills, property tax records, insurance policies, and maintenance receipts spanning 15 years, all in my name. The folder that contained the truth. I also grabbed my purse from the passenger seat, checking to make sure my tablet was inside. The tablet that contained my banking app, my investment accounts, my financial life laid out in numbers and balances, and the kind of cold, hard facts that couldn't be argued with or explained away. When I walked back into the lodge, the conversation stopped again. But this time, instead of standing uncertainly in the doorway, I walked directly to Harold's old chair, my chair, and sat down with the folder in my lap and my purse at my feet. "The police will be here soon," I said conversationally, my voice carrying easily through the suddenly quiet room. "That's good. I think they'll be very interested in what I have to show them." Melissa's confidence faltered for just a moment, a crack in her composure that was quickly covered, but not quick enough. "Eleanor, please don't make this harder than it has to be. We all know you're confused about the ownership situation. Do we?" I asked, my voice mild and curious. "Mark, why don't you tell everyone when exactly your father changed his will to leave this place to you?" Mark's face went red, and he took a long drink of his beer before answering. "Mom, you know Dad talked about wanting us to have this place. You know he wanted to keep it in the family." "I'm sure he did want to keep it in the family," I agreed. "In fact, I know exactly what his will says about keeping things in the family. Would you like me to read it to everyone?" The silence stretched tight as a wire. Outside, I could hear the sound of vehicles coming up the mountain road, engines working hard against the grade and the snow. The cavalry was coming, but I was no longer afraid of which side they would take. Through the window, I saw the red and blue lights of police cruisers reflecting off the falling snow, painting the white landscape in alternating colors of authority and consequence. 2 vehicles pulled into the driveway, their occupants taking their time to assess the situation before approaching the house. When the knock came at the door, firm and professional, the sound echoed through the lodge like a judgment. Melissa moved to answer it, her chin raised defiantly, every inch the righteous homeowner dealing with an unfortunate family situation. "Officers, thank you for coming so quickly," she began, but one of the policemen, a tall man with graying hair and the kind of steady eyes that came from years of sorting truth from lies, held up a hand to stop her. "Ma'am, we'll need to hear from everyone involved before we make any decisions. Is the elderly woman you called about still here?" "I'm right here, officer," I said, rising from my chair with as much dignity as my hospital-weakened body could manage. "My name is Eleanor Brooks, and this is my house." The second officer, a younger woman with short brown hair and a skeptical expression, looked around the room at the party in progress, at the food and wine and well-dressed guests, at the clear signs of people who belonged in this space. "Ma'am, these folks seem pretty settled in here. Do you have any documentation that proves your ownership of this property?" I smiled then, the first genuine smile I'd managed since walking into this nightmare. "Officer, I have all the documentation you could possibly need. Would you like to see it?" The next 20 minutes unfolded like a slow-motion avalanche, beautiful and terrible and absolutely unstoppable. I sat in Harold's chair, my chair, and methodically laid out 15 years of documentation while the 2 police officers examined each piece with the thoroughness of people who had seen enough domestic disputes to know that the truth usually lay buried under layers of family drama and wishful thinking. The deed, bearing my name as sole owner, purchased in 1987 with Harold Brooks as my husband, transferred to my name alone upon his death. The will, properly witnessed and notarized, stating clearly that all property should pass to Eleanor Brooks upon Harold Brooks' death, with no mention whatsoever of early inheritance or gifts to children. The property tax records, paid quarterly from my checking account for the past 4 years. The homeowner's insurance policy, listing me as the sole policyholder and beneficiary. Each document landed on the coffee table like a verdict, and I watched Melissa's face grow paler with every piece of evidence. Around the room, Her guests shifted uncomfortably, some beginning to gather their coats and purses, clearly recognizing that this pleasant mountain getaway had turned into something much more serious. "Ma'am," the older officer said finally, looking directly at Melissa, "this documentation clearly shows that Mrs. Brooks is the legal owner of this property. Did you have her permission to be here tonight?" Melissa's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, like a fish pulled from water. Mark stepped forward, his face flushed with embarrassment and what might have been anger. "This is ridiculous," he said, his voice rising. "She's my mother. This is family property. Dad always intended for us to inherit this place." "Sir," the younger officer said patiently, "intentions and legal ownership are two different things. Do you have any documentation showing that the property was transferred to you?" "We've been living here," Melissa said desperately. "We've been taking care of the place, paying for maintenance, treating it like our own home." "With whose permission?" I asked quietly, and the question hung in the air like smoke. "You knew we were using it," Mark said, turning to me with something that looked like betrayal in his eyes. "You never said we couldn't." And there it was, the moment when the truth became unavoidable. They had been using my generosity against me, interpreting my silence as consent, my grief as abdication. They had moved into my life like floodwater, slowly and steadily, until I was drowning in their assumptions and their entitlement. "Officer," I said, reaching for my purse, "I'd like to show you something else." I pulled out my tablet, my fingers moving across the screen with more confidence than I felt. The banking app opened to reveal my main account, the one that held my teacher's pension and Harold's military benefits and the modest investments we had made over 38 years of careful saving. "Mark," I said, my voice steady as stone, "the apartment you and Melissa live in? The one you've been renting for the past 3 years? Take a look at this." I turned the tablet screen toward him, showing the monthly automatic payment to Westfield Property Management, $2,800 every month for 36 months. His name was on the lease, but the money came from my account. Had always come from my account. "Rent subsidy," I said, my finger hovering over the cancel button. Cancelled. The click of my finger against the screen was impossibly loud in the silent room. Mark's face went white as he realized what I'd just done, what it meant for his family's housing situation, what it meant for his carefully constructed life built on his mother's financial foundation. "Mom, wait," he started, but I was already navigating to the next screen. "The car parked outside," I continued, my voice taking on the rhythmic quality of someone reading a grocery list. "The red sedan. The loan for that vehicle required a cosigner because your credit wasn't quite good enough, wasn't it, Mark?" I found the auto loan account, saw the balance of $23,000 still owed on what had been a $35,000 vehicle. Saw Mark's name as primary borrower and my name as guarantor, the person responsible if he defaulted, the person whose good credit had made the loan possible in the first place. "Loan guarantee," I said, my finger poised over another button. Revoked. Another click. Another foundation stone removed from the life they had built on my generosity. "And this," I said, navigating to the savings account I had opened 2 years ago, the one I had funded with $50,000 from Harold's life insurance policy, the one I had given them access to for emergencies and family expenses and just in case something comes up. The balance was $7,200. They had spent $42,800 of my husband's death benefit on their emergencies, their expenses, their just-in-case situations. $42,800 that Harold had intended to secure my future, gone to fund their lifestyle while I recovered from pneumonia in a hospital bed. "The family emergency fund," I said, my voice never wavering. "Closed." Click. The sound echoed through the room like a gavel falling, and I realized that everyone, the police officers, the party guests, Mark and Melissa, was staring at me with a mixture of awe and horror. Watching a sweet old lady systematically dismantle a life with nothing but a tablet and an internet connection. "Ma'am," the older officer said quietly, "do you want these people removed from your property?" I looked around the room one more time, at the ruins of what had been a pleasant party, at the faces of people who had been enjoying my hospitality without knowing it, at my son who stood with his head in his hands like a man watching his life collapse in real time. "No," I said finally. "I think they can find their own way out." The silence that followed my words was deeper than the mountain snow outside, heavier than the weight of 38 years of marriage, more final than the sound of dirt hitting Harold's coffin. Nobody moved for what felt like an eternity, as if the entire room had been frozen in place by the magnitude of what had just occurred. Then Melissa began to cry. Not the gentle tears of sadness or remorse, but the harsh, desperate sobs of someone watching their world end in real time. Her perfectly applied makeup ran in dark streams down her cheeks, and her hands shook as she reached for something to steady herself against. "Eleanor, please," she whispered, her voice broken and raw. "Please, you can't do this. We have nowhere to go. The children. What about the children?" For a moment, just a moment, I felt the familiar tug of sympathy that had governed so much of my life. The impulse to fix, to help, to make everything better for everyone else regardless of the cost to myself. The maternal instinct that had driven me to support them financially for years, to enable their dreams even when those dreams were built on my sacrifice. But then I remembered the word she had used to describe me just an hour ago. Parasite. I remembered the contempt in her voice, the casual cruelty of someone who thought I was too weak and too old and too dependent to fight back. I remembered standing in my own doorway and being told I didn't belong in my own home. "You called me a parasite," I said quietly, my voice carrying clearly through the room. "But a parasite feeds off others without giving anything back. Tell me, Melissa, who exactly has been the parasite in this relationship?" She couldn't answer, could only sob harder as the weight of her own words came back to haunt her. Around the room, her guests were quietly gathering their things, their faces carefully neutral as they tried to extract themselves from this family drama without taking sides or causing further offense. Mark finally raised his head, his eyes red with what might have been tears or might have been anger. "Mom, this is vindictive. This is cruel. We're family." "Family," I repeated, tasting the word like something bitter. "Harold and I were family. We built this place together, saved for it together, dreamed about it together. We were partners in everything for 38 years. You want to know what he said about family?" I stood slowly, my hospital weakened legs protesting, but my spine straight, my voice gaining strength with every word. "He said that blood doesn't make family, choices do. He said that respect isn't automatic, it's earned. He said that love without boundaries isn't love at all. It's just enabling dressed up in prettier clothes." I moved to the fireplace, where their family portrait sat in place of my wedding photograph. Without ceremony, I picked it up and handed it to Melissa. "He also said that a man who doesn't protect his wife's future doesn't deserve to call himself a husband. And a son who would steal from his own mother doesn't deserve to call himself a son." The words hung in the air like a curse, and I saw Mark flinch as if I had struck him. Good. Let him feel the sting of truth for once in his entitled life. The party guests were filing out now, murmuring polite goodbyes and thank yous to Melissa while carefully avoiding eye contact with me. I didn't blame them. They had come for a pleasant evening of food and wine and mountain views, not to witness the destruction of a family. But their departure left the lodge feeling larger somehow, more echo-filled, more mine. "You need to leave," I said simply, addressing the room but looking directly at Melissa. "All of you. Now." "Mom dash," Mark started, but I cut him off with a look that would have stopped traffic. "You can call me Mrs. Brooks from now on," I said. "You lost the right to call me Mom when you decided to steal from me." The younger police officer stepped forward, her hand resting casually on her belt in the universal gesture of law enforcement maintaining peace. "Folks, I think it's time to wrap this up. Mrs. Brooks has made her wishes clear, and this is her property. I suggest you gather your belongings and vacate the premises." What followed was the most pathetic exodus I had ever witnessed. Melissa stumbled around the lodge like a sleepwalker, collecting wine glasses and serving platters with trembling hands. Mark loaded folding chairs and coolers into his truck with the mechanical movements of someone in shock. They worked in silence, occasionally bumping into each other or reaching for the same item, their careful party coordination replaced by the clumsy desperation of people fleeing a disaster. They tried to take things that weren't theirs. A throw blanket Harold and I had bought in Santa Fe, a cutting board I had made in woodworking class, a bottle of wine from our cellar. Each time, I simply pointed, and they reluctantly put the item back where it belonged. "The keys," I said when they were finally finished loading their cars. "To the new locks you installed." Melissa fumbled in her purse and produced a set of keys, dropping them twice before successfully placing them in my outstretched palm. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely control her movements. "And Harold's robe," I added, noting the burgundy fleece she still wore like a costume. She shrugged out of it wordlessly, leaving her in a thin sweater that provided little protection against the mountain cold. I took the robe and held it against my chest, feeling the familiar softness that still somehow carried a faint echo of Harold's presence. The police officers waited until the last car had pulled out of the driveway before approaching me one final time. "Mrs. Brooks, are you going to be all right up here alone?" the older officer asked, genuine concern in his voice. "Officer," I said, looking out at my snow-covered sanctuary, at the place Harold and I had built together, at the home that was finally mine again, "I'm going to be better than all right. I'm going to be free." They left shortly after, their taillights disappearing down the mountain road, leaving me alone in my lodge for the first time in 2 years. I stood in the doorway watching their lights fade, listening to the absolute silence of the mountains, breathing air that suddenly tasted cleaner and lighter than it had in months. Then I closed the door, locked it with my new keys, and turned to survey my reclaimed kingdom. The lodge felt different in the silence that followed their departure. Larger somehow, as if it were breathing again after holding its breath for too long. I moved through the room slowly, not rushing to clean up the detritus of their party, but simply reacquainting myself with the space that Harold and I had created together. In the kitchen, I found evidence of their extended residence, expensive food items in the refrigerator that I had never purchased, spices I didn't recognize, a coffee maker that cost more than Harold and I used to spend on groceries in a month. They had been living well on my money, in my house, with my utilities and my maintenance and my financial support making their mountain lifestyle possible. I sat at the kitchen table Harold had built from lodge pine, running my hands over the smooth surface he had sanded and stained with such care. The memories came flooding back, not the bitter recent ones, but the sweet old ones that I had nearly forgotten in the chaos of loss and manipulation and betrayal. I remembered the weekend Harold had surprised me by announcing he'd learned to make French toast from a YouTube video, and how we'd spent the entire morning burning batch after batch while we laughed and kissed and made increasingly ridiculous suggestions for improvement. I remembered the Christmas morning when we'd opened our gifts to each other right here at this table, matching flannel pajamas that we'd worn for the rest of the day while we played board games and drank hot chocolate and reveled in having nowhere else to be. I remembered the day Harold had been diagnosed with cancer, how we'd sat at this same table holding hands while I cried and he made lists of all the things we still wanted to do together. How we'd planned trips we never took and projects we never finished because the treatments took so much out of him, because his time ran out faster than we'd expected, because 65 years wasn't nearly enough. But I also remembered the conversation we'd had just 6 months before he died, when the treatments weren't working anymore and we both knew it. He'd been worried about me, about what would happen to me after he was gone, about whether I would be strong enough to take care of myself. "Ellie," he'd said, his voice already weakened by the cancer, but his eyes still sharp with the intelligence I'd fallen in love with 40 years earlier, "promise me you won't let people take advantage of your generous heart." I had promised, of course, thinking he was worried about door-to-door salesmen or telephone scammers, the kind of predators who targeted elderly widows. I never imagined he was worried about our own son, about the family we'd raised and loved and supported. Mark's a good boy, Harold had continued, but he's weak. And Melissa? Melissa sees opportunity where she should see family. Don't let kindness become slavery, Ellie. Don't give so much of yourself that there's nothing left for you. At the time, I'd thought he was being overly cautious, perhaps even a little unfair to Mark and Melissa. They had been so helpful during his illness, so supportive, so present during the difficult months of treatments and hospital stays, and the gradual acknowledgement that he wasn't going to recover. Now I understood that Harold's military training had given him skills I lacked, the ability to see through people's motivations, to recognize strategic behavior disguised as love, to understand that sometimes the people closest to you were the ones most likely to exploit your vulnerabilities. I had enabled their entitlement by saying yes to everything, by never setting boundaries, by treating their requests for help as emergencies rather than patterns. When they'd asked me to co-sign for the car loan, I'd said yes because I wanted to help. When they'd needed money for Mark's dental work, I'd opened the family emergency fund without question. When they'd suggested I come live with them after Harold's death, I'd agreed because I thought they genuinely wanted to help me heal. But they hadn't wanted to help me heal. They'd wanted me out of the lodge so they could use it as their private vacation home. They'd wanted access to my finances so they could maintain a lifestyle their salaries couldn't support. They'd wanted me dependent on them so they could gradually assume control of everything Harold and I had built together. The most painful realization was that my own grief had made me complicit in their theft. I had been so lost after Harold's death, so desperate to feel like I still belonged somewhere, that I'd mistaken their manipulation for love. I'd been grateful for their attention, thankful for their willingness to let me stay in their house, appreciative of their offers to help manage my finances and my property. I'd turned myself into exactly what Melissa had called me, a parasite. Not because I took without giving, but because I'd given so much that I'd lost track of my own worth, my own rights, my own power. But sitting in Harold's chair by the fire he'd built, wearing his robe that still smelled faintly of the aftershave he'd worn every day for 20 years, I felt something stirring inside me that I hadn't felt since before his diagnosis. Strength. Clarity. The solid sense of self that comes from knowing exactly who you are and what you will and will not accept. Harold had been right, as he so often was. Kindness without boundaries wasn't kindness at all. It was just weakness dressed up in prettier clothes. And I was done being weak. I didn't have to wait long to see the consequences of my financial decisions ripple outward like stones thrown into still water. The modern world, for all its complexities, moves with brutal efficiency when it comes to money and contracts and the cold mathematics of debt. The first call came 3 days later, while I was sitting by the fire reading one of Harold's military history books and drinking coffee from his favorite mug. The phone rang with the harsh persistence of bad news, and when I answered, a professional voice informed me that the automatic payment for Mark and Melissa's rent had been declined due to insufficient funds. I had closed the account, of course, but hearing the official confirmation felt like watching dominoes fall in slow motion. Westfield Property Management was calling to inform me, as the guarantor on the lease, that the rent was now 36 hours overdue and that late fees would begin accruing immediately. I'm no longer guaranteeing that lease, I told the woman on the phone, my voice steady and businesslike. I suggest you contact the primary tenant directly. Ma'am, that's not how guarantor agreements work, she replied, her tone shifting from polite to concerned. You can't simply withdraw from a legal obligation without proper notice and procedures. She was right, of course. I would have to formally withdraw my guarantee through legal channels, a process that would take weeks or months. But the practical effect was immediate. Mark and Melissa would have to find the rent money somewhere else, and based on what I'd learned about their actual financial situation, that somewhere else didn't exist. The second call came that afternoon. The auto loan company, informing me that my guarantee on Mark's car loan had been revoked, but that proper procedures required 30 days' notice. In the meantime, the The March payment was due in 2 weeks, and if it wasn't received, the vehicle would be subject to repossession. I listened to these calls with a detachment that surprised me. These weren't my emergencies anymore. These were natural consequences of decisions that had been made without my consent, obligations that had been assumed using my name and credit without my permission. I felt no guilt, no urge to swoop in and solve problems that weren't mine to solve. By the end of the week, my phone was ringing constantly. Mark called first, his voice tight with panic, asking if there had been some kind of mistake with the bank accounts. When I explained that there had been no mistake, that I had deliberately canceled their access to my money, the conversation deteriorated quickly. "Mom, you can't do this," he said, and I could hear Melissa crying in the background. "We have bills, we have responsibilities. The kids need stability." "You should have thought about stability before you decided to steal from me," I replied calmly. "You should have thought about responsibility before you spent $43,000 of your father's life insurance money." "We didn't steal anything," he protested, but his voice lacked conviction. "That money was a gift. You said it was for emergencies." "I said it was for your family's emergencies," I corrected. "I didn't say it was for financing a lifestyle you couldn't afford, for vacations to places you'd never been able to visit on your own salary, for a mountain party house that you told people you owned." The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that I wondered if he'd hung up. When he finally spoke again, his voice was smaller, younger, like the little boy who used to confess to breaking things rather than let someone else take the blame. "What do you want us to do?" he asked. It was the first honest question he'd asked me in years, and it deserved an honest answer. "I want you to take responsibility for your own lives," I said. "I want you to pay your own bills with your own money. I want you to live within your means instead of expecting other people to subsidize your dreams. I want you to grow up." He hung up on me after that, but the calls continued. Melissa tried next, alternating between tears and anger, begging and threats. She promised they would pay back every penny if I would just restore their access to the accounts. She swore they'd never ask for help again if I would just get them through this one crisis. She threatened to keep me away from my grandchildren if I didn't reconsider my cruel and vindictive behavior. I listened to it all with the patience of someone who had finally learned to distinguish between genuine remorse and strategic manipulation. When she finished her performance, I said simply, "If you ever find yourself in trouble again, don't call me. Call the police. They already know the way." Then I hung up and blocked their numbers. The financial collapse followed the trajectory I had expected. Without my support, they couldn't make their rent payment. Without the rent payment, they faced eviction proceedings. The car, financed on Mark's inadequate credit with my guarantee, was repossessed when they missed the payment to try to cover the rent instead. I learned about each development not from them, but from the various companies and agencies that still had my contact information as a reference or former guarantor. Each phone call was another step in their descent from comfortable middle-class stability to the kind of financial chaos that people create when they live beyond their means for too long. But the most satisfying call came from an unexpected source. Melissa's mother, a woman I had met only briefly at their wedding, but who now felt compelled to lecture me about family loyalty and Christian forgiveness. "Eleanor, I don't know what's gotten into you," she said, her voice sharp with disapproval. "Melissa told me what you've done, and I'm shocked. Absolutely shocked. How can you turn your back on your own family like this?" "Mrs. Patterson," I said, remembering her name from the wedding reception where she'd spent most of the evening complaining about the cost of everything. "Did Melissa tell you that she called me a parasite in my own home? Did she mention that they'd changed the locks to keep me out of the house my husband and I built together? Did she explain that they spent $43,000 of my money without asking?" The silence that followed was delicious. "Well," she said finally, her voice considerably less certain, "I'm sure there are two sides to every story." "I'm sure there are," I agreed. "But some sides have documentation, and some sides just have excuses." She hung up shortly after that, but not before I heard her muttering something about ungrateful children and not knowing the whole story. I suspected Melissa's version of events had left out some crucial details, like the part where they'd been living in my house and spending my money while telling everyone they owned the place. Over the following weeks, I pieced together the full scope of their collapse from various sources. Mark lost his job, not directly because of the financial scandal, but because the stress and distraction of his crumbling personal life affected his work performance. Melissa's part-time position at a boutique ended when the store found out about their legal troubles. The children had to be pulled out of their expensive private school and enrolled in public school, a change that probably did them good, but which Melissa treated like a personal catastrophe. They moved in with Melissa's parents temporarily, an arrangement that lasted exactly 3 weeks before Mrs. Patterson called me again, this time to ask if I'd reconsider helping them find their own place. "They're good kids who made some bad choices," she pleaded. "Surely you can find it in your heart to forgive them." "Mrs. Patterson," I said gently, "they're not kids. Mark is 38 years old. At his age, your father was supporting a wife and 3 children on a factory worker's salary without anyone's help. These aren't children who made innocent mistakes. These are adults who chose to steal from an elderly widow because they thought I was too weak to stop them. But they have children of their own," she protested. "Your grandchildren. Don't you care about them?" I did care about them more than she could possibly understand. But I also understood something she apparently didn't, that children learn more from watching their parents face consequences than they ever learn from watching their parents get rescued from those consequences. "I care about them enough to hope their parents learn to provide for them honestly," I said. "I care about them enough to hope they grow up understanding that actions have consequences and that family isn't a license to steal." When I hung up that time, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, the deep satisfaction of being completely, unequivocally right. 6 weeks after that snowy February night in the lodge, my phone rang one last time. I almost didn't answer, thinking it might be another creditor or property manager or well-meaning relative calling to update me on Mark and Melissa's continued decline. I had grown tired of being the audience for their ongoing drama, tired of being expected to feel guilty for the natural consequences of their choices. But something made me pick up the phone, perhaps curiosity or perhaps the faint hope that one of them might finally be ready to have an honest conversation about what had happened between us. It was Melissa, and she was crying again. But this time, the tears sounded different, not the angry, frustrated sobs of someone who felt wronged, but the broken, desperate weeping of someone who had finally reached the end of their resources and their excuses. "Eleanor," she whispered, her voice so small I had to strain to hear it. "Please, I was wrong. I was so wrong about everything. We have nowhere else to go." I sat in Harold's chair by the fire, listening to her break down completely over the phone, and felt the strangest mixture of vindication and sorrow. This was what I had wanted, wasn't it? For her to finally understand what she had done, to finally acknowledge the magnitude of her betrayal, to finally face the reality of her situation without my money to cushion the fall. "We're living in Mark's truck," she continued, her words tumbling over each other in their desperation. "The kids are staying with my parents, but there's no room for us and we can't find anywhere else because our credit is destroyed and we don't have money for deposits and nobody will rent to us without references." She painted a picture of complete destitution, sleeping in parking lots, washing in gas station bathrooms, eating fast food when they could afford it and going hungry when they couldn't. Mark had found some day labor work, but it wasn't steady, and it didn't pay enough to dig them out of the hole they'd created. "I know you hate me," she said, her voice breaking completely. "I know I called you terrible names, and I know I hurt you, and I know I don't deserve your help. But please, Eleanor, please. I'm begging you. I'll do anything, I'll sign anything. I'll pay back every penny somehow. Just please help us get back on our feet." I listened to her plead and grovel and promise things she couldn't possibly deliver, and I felt something unexpected, not sympathy exactly, but a kind of clinical interest in watching someone hit what addiction counselors call rock bottom. This was what it looked like when someone finally ran out of other people's money, other people's goodwill, other people's willingness to enable their poor choices. When she finally ran out of words and breath, when the silence stretched between us like a canyon, I spoke for the first time since answering the phone. "Melissa," I said, my voice calm and clear and completely without emotion. "Do you remember what you called me that night in the lodge?" "I called you a parasite," she whispered. "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry, I didn't mean it." "But you did mean it," I said gently. "You meant it completely. You looked at me in my own home, wearing my late husband's robe, drinking from my grandmother's crystal, and you saw a parasite. Something that fed off others without giving anything back." "I was wrong," she sobbed. "I was so wrong." "No," I said, and my voice carried the authority of absolute certainty. "You were right. There was a parasite in that room that night. But it wasn't me." The silence that followed was deeper than the mountain snow, heavier than 38 years of marriage, more final than the sound of a coffin being lowered into the ground. "Eleanor, please dash," she started, but I cut her off with the gentle finality of someone who had already made their decision. "If you ever find yourself in trouble again," I said, repeating the words I had used weeks earlier, "don't call me. Call the police. They already know the way." I ended the call and immediately blocked her number, just as I had blocked Mark's. Then I turned off my phone completely and sat in the profound silence of my reclaimed home, watching the fire Harold had built crackle and dance in the fireplace we had planned together. For the first time in 2 years, I slept that night without guilt, without worry, without the weight of other people's problems pressing down on my chest like a stone. I slept the deep, dreamless sleep of someone who had finally learned the difference between helping and enabling, between love and manipulation, between family and parasites. When I woke the next morning to sunlight streaming through the windows Harold had installed, to coffee brewed in the kitchen we had designed together, to the absolute peace of a home that was finally mine again, I understood what Harold had been trying to tell me all those months before he died. Sometimes the greatest act of love is learning to say no. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do for someone is to let them face the consequences of their choices. Sometimes the most generous gift you can give is the gift of independence, theirs and yours. The snow fell gently outside my windows as I sat writing the story, each flake catching the light from the fire Harold had taught me to build properly, settling onto the deck we had stained together every spring for 15 years. The lodge was quiet except for the sound of wood crackling and the wind sighing through the pine trees we had planted as saplings, trees that were now tall enough to touch the eaves of our roof. 6 months had passed since that February night when I reclaimed my life from the people who had stolen it piece by piece, dollar by dollar, boundary by boundary. 6 months of learning to live alone again, not in the desperate solitude of grief, but in the chosen solitude of someone who had finally remembered her own worth. The legal proceedings had been straightforward once the lawyers got involved. Mark and Melissa's informal claims to my property dissolved under the harsh light of actual documentation, and their threats to contest Harold's will evaporated when they realized they couldn't afford an attorney. My financial support of their lifestyle ended completely, definitively, permanently. I heard occasional updates about their situation from mutual acquaintances, people who thought I might want to know how they were faring, people who perhaps expected me to feel guilty about their continued struggles. Mark had found steady work finally, a job that paid less than his previous position, but came with the dignity of honest labor. Melissa had taken a full-time position at a department store, work that required her to be on her feet for 8 hours a day, but provided health insurance for the children. They were living in a small apartment in a less expensive part of town, driving a used car they had bought with cash, learning to live within their actual means rather than the inflated lifestyle my money had made possible. By all accounts, they were surviving, adapting, perhaps even growing from the experience of having to support themselves. I felt no satisfaction in their struggles, but I felt no guilt either. They were experiencing the natural consequences of their choices, learning lessons that should have been learned years earlier, discovering what millions of people already knew, that you can only spend what you actually earn. That you can only live where you can actually afford, that family isn't a license to steal from people who love you. Sometimes, in my weaker moments, I wondered if I had been too harsh, too final, too unforgiving. These doubts usually came late at night when the lodge felt large and empty, when the silence pressed against my eardrums like water, when I remembered how it felt to be surrounded by family even if that family was slowly destroying me. But then I would remember Melissa's voice calling me a parasite in my own home, and the doubts would fade like smoke in the wind. I would remember the feeling of standing in my own doorway and being told I didn't belong, of watching strangers toast each other with my wine while sitting in the chairs Harold and I had chosen together. I would remember the cold calculation in her eyes as she dialed 911 to have me removed from my own property. And I would remember Harold's words about kindness becoming slavery, about love requiring boundaries, about the difference between helping someone and enabling them. He had known, somehow, that this day would come. He had prepared me for it even as cancer was killing him, even as he struggled to find breath for words, even as his own time was running out. The hardest part hadn't been cutting off their money or reclaiming my property. The hardest part had been accepting that I had been complicit in my own exploitation, that my generosity had become a weakness they could exploit, that my love for family had blinded me to the difference between family and parasites. But understanding that had also been liberating. For the first time in years, I was responsible only for myself. My money went to my needs, my desires, my future. My home was arranged for my comfort, filled with my memories, organized according to my preferences. My time was my own, not subdivided among other people's emergencies and demands and endless requests for support. I had begun to travel, something Harold and I had always planned to do more of after retirement. I visited the places we had marked on maps, the national parks we had researched, the historical sites he had read about in his military history books. I carried his ashes with me sometimes, scattering small amounts in places I knew he would have loved, keeping the promise we had made to see the world together even if he could only experience it through my eyes now. I had also begun to volunteer, something that felt like a natural extension of my teaching career. I worked with other widows, helping them navigate the financial and emotional challenges of sudden independence. I taught classes on budgeting and boundary setting, sharing the hard-won wisdom of someone who had learned the difference between helping and enabling through painful experience. Some of the women I worked with were struggling with similar situations, adult children who treated their parents like ATM machines, family members who assumed that love meant unlimited financial support, relatives who confused generosity with stupidity. I helped them understand what I had learned too late, that saying no is sometimes the most loving thing you can do, that enabling someone's poor choices isn't kindness, that setting boundaries isn't cruelty. The lodge had become exactly what Harold and I had envisioned, a peaceful retreat, a place of healing, a sanctuary from the noise and demands of the world. But now it was something more. It was proof that I could take care of myself, that I could live independently, that I could be happy without subsidizing other people's happiness. Sometimes, very rarely, I allowed myself to imagine what might have happened if Mark and Melissa had made different choices that night. If they had apologized immediately and sincerely. If they had acknowledged their wrongdoing and asked for forgiveness rather than demanding continued support. If they had shown any genuine remorse for the pain they had caused rather than just anger at being caught. I thought I might have been able to forgive them, given enough time and genuine repentance. I thought we might have been able to rebuild some kind of relationship based on honesty rather than exploitation, on respect rather than entitlement. I thought the grandchildren might have been able to know their grandmother as someone other than a source of money. But they hadn't made those choices. They had chosen denial, anger, manipulation, and threats. They had chosen to see themselves as victims rather than perpetrators, to blame me for their consequences rather than themselves for their actions. And so I had chosen to let them go completely, permanently, finally. As I finished writing this story, I realized that I no longer thought of myself as Harold's widow or Mark's mother, or anyone's grandmother. I thought of myself simply as Eleanor Brooks, a woman who had learned to value herself enough to demand respect, who had learned to love herself enough to set boundaries, who had learned to honor her late husband's memory by protecting the future he had tried to secure for her. The fire burned low in the fireplace, and snow continued to fall outside the windows, and the lodge settled around me with the comfortable sounds of a home well built and well loved. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear the call of an owl, a sound Harold had always said meant the mountain was welcoming us home. I pulled his old robe tighter around my shoulders and smiled. For the first time in years, I slept without guilt, without worry, without the weight of other people's problems. I slept the sleep of someone who had finally learned that sometimes revenge doesn't roar. Sometimes it simply watches in silence while the guilty drown in their own lies. For the first time in years, I slept without parasites. And I dreamed of Harold, young and strong and proud, telling me he had always known I had the strength to take care of myself. He just had to wait for me to remember it too. Sometimes the greatest act of love is learning when to let go. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do is allow people to face the consequences of their choices. And sometimes the most generous gift you can give someone is the gift of independence. Theirs and yours. Family isn't defined by blood or obligation, but by respect, love, and the choice to treat each other with dignity. When those elements disappear, what remains isn't family at all. It's just people who happen to share a name. This is the story of a woman who learned the difference. This is the story of a parasite who forgot which one of them was feeding off the other. This is the story of how silence can be the loudest form of justice and how peace, once reclaimed, feels like coming home.